Good morning. Yes, it's me again. Our latest class, our latest video. You can either find it in the files or I'm going to post these directly to YouTube. If you haven't already subscribed, you could do that. Maybe that's easier for you to get to these. So we're on the next lesson here. It's Chapter 10, Lesson 2, also titled Distance Learning 3. This is going to be about political parties today. Parties have symbols that represent the party. It's part of what we'll be talking about in our next lesson, ideas of propaganda. We tie things to symbols, so we have something that's immediately identifiable. The symbols tend to give you some idea what these groups are about, and the symbols help these parties make their messages. So Abby, what are the two big political parties in the United States today?
Democrat and Republican.
Democrat and Republican. And what symbol symbolizes the Democratic Party?
The donkey.
The donkey. I'm a simple person. The way I remember that, and the only way I can, is D is for Democrat, D is for donkey. And the next big party is the Republicans, symbolized by the?
Elephant.
Yeah, and I don't have a way to remember that. I just remember the Democrats. Do we have only two political parties?
No.
No. We have others.
Mm-hmm.
Do they tend to win elections, particularly big elections like presidential elections?
No.
No, but they're important nonetheless. So some of the big ones we've talked about is the Green Party. What is the Green Party's platform?
The environment.
Environmental issues. Is that all they care about in their platform? No. They're going to have other platform issues and ideas, but their big issue is protecting the environment. How about the Libertarian Party? We mentioned them. That's relatively big as a third party. What do the Libertarians think?
Smaller government?
Absolutely right. Libertarians basically think government has to be small as possible, to the point where you almost have no government. Now, the Republicans already believe in small government, but the Libertarians take that a step further and say you should basically have no government at all. It's tough for that to be practical sometimes, but hey, they believe in it, and a lot of other people believe in it. How about the Communist Party?
They think...
What is part of communist ideology?
Everything should be, like, shared among...
And who
people.
owns and tells the businesses what to do?
The government?
The government. Communism, amongst other things they believe in, believes that the entire system, to include the entire world of business, is controlled by the government. So the government decides how much you get paid, what businesses can make, etc. So communism is this idea where everything is owned by the government runs everything. Communism also tends to create authoritarian, single-party dictatorships where there's only one government, only one party, and that would be, of course, the Communist Party. Awesome. So that's another graph. This data's a little old. If you can see it on your slideshow, of course, that's going to be easier. That's 2004. Is that old data? Yes. But is it still accurate to today? Yes. You'll see we have two major parties, Democratic and Republican. The bulk of Americans are Democratic or Republican, but everybody else falls into the Independent Party, which is, some people say, yes, they're independent, and others who say, I'm a Reform Party member, Green, Communist, whatever, okay? So the two major parties, Democrats and Republicans, they get the money, they get the support, they get the attention of the media, and they always get on the what?
Ballot.
Ballot. They'll always be on the ballot. States are in charge of their own elections. In Florida, when they create these ballots, there's automatically going to be space for Republican, Democratic candidates. Maybe not if you're the third party candidate. If I was a third party candidate, Abigail, what might I have to do to get on a ballot?
Get enough support during the preliminary elections?
Yes. I may have to prove to the state election committee that I have enough support to be on the ballot, and usually what they'll look for is a petition. I circulate a petition, I get X amount of people to sign it, and I could be on the ballot. They'll have other requirements too. I've looked at this before, and it varies state to state, because each state runs its own election systems. And if I remember, Florida was, you circulate a petition, you pay them some money, they get you on the ballot. Great. Is it impossible? No. But is it harder and more challenging, particularly for a third party that doesn't have volunteers, people, and money support? Absolutely. All right. Parties are organized like anything else. Just like a school has to be organized, you have a principal who's in charge, an assistant principal that helps, administrative staff that does administrative things like guidance and counseling, maintenance staff that fixes stuff, and teachers that teach. Parties have leadership too. So the two big parties will be organized with national committees. The big jobs of the national committees are what, Abigail?
To raise money.
Raise money, because what makes the world go around?
Money.
Yeah. There's other important things in life too, but you're not too young to figure out that you need money to get things done. So the big thing that these national parties do is they raise money. What do they raise this money for? To get their candidates elected, okay? And the biggest election, of course, for a party isn't a city election or a state governor election or a senatorial election. The big thing that these parties are looking at, the culmination of what these parties are about, is picking and electing a president, of course. And we see this right now. Yeah, you can't not, I guess. 2020 is an election year, so we're going through this process right now. The Republican Party and Democratic Party are working to find their candidates for election. And guess what? They're almost there, whether you realize it or not. So, Abigail, who will the Republicans have as their candidate for president?
Trump.
Trump. If you are the current president, more than likely you will be that party's candidate for president again. You're already there. You do not see in history where the party says, yeah, you're the president right now, but we're dumping you. Goodbye. We're going to have another candidate. We have had presidents not run. Famous case in point, do you know any president that was president and then decided he wouldn't run for re-election?
Not off the top of my head.
LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson. He was getting his backside kicked about the Vietnam War, and he's like, you know what? I don't think I could win, so he doesn't run for president, famously. And it's unusual. Most of the time you're president, you want to be president again, it's a cool job. Do you know how much a president gets paid a year?
Oh gosh, like millions.
$450,000 a year.
Really?
Yes. You can make a lot more money by being a basketball player, an actor, or just a business person, right? But you get all the other cool stuff that comes with being a president. So if you are elected president, most presidents in history do run for that second term. So the Republicans will have Donald J. Trump as their candidate for the Republican Party for the 2020 presidential election. How are the Democrats doing? Abby, you know where they are in selecting a candidate for president?
I think it's down to Biden.
And?
Bernie.
Yes. The Democratic field was big for a while. It almost got to 20 people, but it narrows down over time as the primaries happen in each state. And as you win primaries in a state, basically an election in that state, you gather momentum, you realize you have a chance to win, you get these things called delegates who say, yes, they'll support you to be the candidate, and you eventually be the candidate. So Kamala Harris drops out, and Bloomberg drops out, and Pete Buttigieg drops out as they don't do well in these primary elections. Where we are now is you really have two candidates left, and really there's only one. At this point, Joe Biden has pretty decisively beaten his next competitor, Bernie Sanders, and a lot of people are waiting for Sanders to say, I give up. But right now, he's still talking like he's in the fight. So the Democrats are Joe Biden, who is Obama's vice president, and Senator from Vermont, who is, you know what party he is?
Republican?
He's basically an independent. He will run as a Democrat, but he'll typically describe himself as a Democratic Socialist or an independent. He's not always identified himself as a straight Democrat. So that's where we are currently.
So, both of those candidates are pretty old. Like,
All
they
the
would turn 80 in their presidency.
Sure. I think Donald Trump is like 74. Joe Biden maybe a couple of years older than that, maybe 3 years older than that.
Sanders is like 79, I think.
Yeah, and Bernie Sanders is old. So yes, right now we are seeing that the presidential candidates are in their mid to higher 70s. But there's no requirement for that.
Yeah.
It's what voters are comfortable with, and it's kind of strange. So we did see some young candidates. Pete Buttigieg, the Democrat, I think was one of the younger ones. Andrew Yang, he didn't last too long. He was young too. And when I say young, I'm not talking middle school young.
No.
They're not 12, 13, but they're young to me because they were younger than me. They were in probably their low mid 40s, and I'm a little bit older than that. Okay, so that's where we are currently. So the national parties, they raise money, organize the party, and they organize the national convention. The national convention is going to be like this big meeting and party that happens at the end of this process, where all the delegates meet and they say, yes, this is going to be our candidate. So the Republicans, it's going to be pretty easy. It's Donald Trump. Democrats, they may be still fighting with delegates going for Biden and some delegates still for Bernie Sanders. But the convention is a big political party where the delegates pledge their loyalty and support for one candidate or another. All right. Sometimes you'll see this word in politics as a caucus. That's a term for a political meeting. Any questions on that?
What if there's like a draw in choosing the delegates? Does that happen, or is that like impossible?
That's a good question. I'm not sure how the parties do it. You've stumped me. I'll have to Google that and look that up.
Because I wonder if like it did happen to be a tie, would they both get on the ballot, or is that like that can't happen?
What I vaguely remember is what the parties do is they keep meeting and debating and voting and voting and voting until one side has persuaded some delegates to flip.
Okay.
So what I would do is I would try to persuade one or two delegates for the other team to join my team to get the win.
Kind of like on the Supreme Court.
Like the Supreme Court. Humans are humans, and people argue and try to convince each other, and frankly, sometimes they'll do deals. Support me now and I'll support you later type stuff. So the delegates would argue and debate about that, and if there was ever a tie, my assumption would be the delegates would debate, they'd vote again, and then they'd pick their party's candidate for president. This primary system is not in the Constitution. It's up to the parties how they run it. And we know this process can't be in the Constitution because the Constitution does not address what?
Political parties.
Political parties at all. The Constitution tells you how you elect a president, but the Constitution says nothing about how parties pick a candidate for the simple reason of the Constitution doesn't mention parties at all. All right. This may not show up well in the video. Please, by all means, look at the PowerPoint in the file section on Teams. So at the bottom, the worker bees are precinct workers. A political party splits the entire country into precincts. Think of them as big neighborhoods. So I would volunteer. I'm Steve Bienkowski. I become a precinct worker for the Democratic or Republican Party. Then I'll do things to help the party out as a volunteer. I make phone calls, I knock on doors, I hand out pamphlets, etc. My next boss will be called a precinct captain. Typically another volunteer who is more experienced, is maybe doing this for a while. The precinct captain will be in charge of these precinct workers, and they'll drive you around when you're handing out pamphlets. They'll help with websites, help answering phones, etc. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So you add up all these precincts until you get the higher level. Then those precincts will be a city level or a county level, and then eventually a state level. So Florida will start small. We'll have a bunch of precincts in Milton and Santa Rosa County, and then all those precincts would basically work for the state committee, and then the state committee represents the state at the national level. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So like anything else, there has to be a chain of command in an organization. At the very lowest level, it's a precinct with precinct workers. People like you and I. We can volunteer to make phone calls, knock on doors, hand out pamphlets and say, "Hi, have you ever thought about voting for Steve Bienkowski of the U.S. Civics Party? Here's a little pamphlet, read about him. What does he believe in? He believes in Kahoot. He believes in distance learning. He believes that everybody should get into files and start looking to see what's in there so we know what you need to be doing." And our first work assignment is really going to be due April 10th. The state committee would be the next big level representing the state, and at the top there's a national committee chairperson that organized the big mission of the national convention and manage all these big money issues, etc. Yes, ma'am.
So who's, like, is anyone in this ranking, like, in charge of, like, commercials, or is that, like, just a separate party? They deal with that on their own type of thing?
Great question. When you're talking at commercials, you're talking the more senior people will be managing that because it takes time, expertise, and money. I mean, I'm sure I'm doing a great job doing these videos, but I can't make professional commercials. I'm not skilled at that, right? So what typically happens for a presidential election, the national chairperson and the committee hire professional organizations. I go out and hire people who their whole job is to make commercials. They may make commercials for Nike, they make commercials for Ford. I try to hire them to make commercials for Donald Trump or Bernie Sanders or Steve Bienkowski, U.S. Civics Party. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay, so at these levels, you start having professionals who get paid to do this, running this stuff. Here, volunteers and amateurs. Up here, people who do it for a living and make decent money doing it. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Cool. Next vocabulary term is political machine. This term's kind of out of use. It's more of a historical term. Back in America, 18 to through 1900s, as the parties became more powerful, they created these things called political machines. And the political machine would work for the party to get candidates elected. But they were corrupt and crooked. They would pay you for votes. They would help you vote multiple times. The political machines would show up at the docks as the immigrants would come in and then just try to recruit them all to join their parties. Political machines, once they got a candidate elected, would then pay their voters back. So in New York, the system was run by this guy named Boss Tweed of Tammany Hall. So he basically controlled the entire city and the entire political structure. So if you wanted to get a job in New York City, working for the city as a policeman, fireman, things like that, you had to work through Boss Tweed. So at the minimum, you had to join his party, you probably had to work for him as a political volunteer, and at some point you probably had to pay some of the money you're getting for your job to him and his organization. So Abigail's in New York during Boss Tweed's time. She's a new immigrant. Boss Tweed's representatives would say, well, not then because women couldn't vote. Let's pretend Abigail's male. They would find Abigail, come off the boat as an immigrant, recruit him into the party, try to get him to vote for Boss Tweed's candidates. Then later he would need something and the payback would be, well, work for my candidate. Now Abby wants to be a New York police officer. Great. Does she get it because she's a good candidate? No. She gets the job through her political connections and connections with the political machine. So now Abigail's a police officer for the city of New York. What's she going to do? She's going to work for the party on her own time, and she's going to pay back some of the money she gets to that party that gave her the job. So the political machine would say, hey, Abby, you're getting a paycheck now, right? Why did you get that job? Because of me. Give me 15% of your paycheck every week or month.
And what if they don't?
Then they'd get you fired, and I would hire somebody else into that job who would pay me 15%.
So what if, like, they just don't agree in the first place to work for them or vote for their party?
That's great, but you don't get the help from the political machine. which could be things like jobs. And if you're a new immigrant, do you think it's easy for you to get a job?
No.
You have a family, you're hungry, you just got here, you barely speak the language, you want a job.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard for you to get. Here's a person who's going to give you a job. And it's a pretty good one with a regular paycheck, you wear a uniform, you have a constant income stream. You're going to want that job. You're going to say, hey, I'll give up 15% to the political machine to have a job. All it means is instead of getting $100 a month, I get $85 a month. And gee, that is not great, but is it better than $0 a month?
Yeah.
Yeah, $0 a month.
So like, how was this just like accepted, or like, I'm not saying it's legal, but like how did they get away with it for a long time?
First, the political machines would run the city. So who would go after them? No one. Except for journalists. People knew these things were corrupt. This is a political cartoon talking about Boss Tweed, and you'll see it better in the slideshow. This says city jail. So people knew the system was corrupt. So who would try to fix the system? People who are trying to reform it, citizens like you and me, newspapers, some honest people in government. But these machines were so big and powerful, they really didn't face any kind of real enemy. Because they run the entire city. Who's going to come after me?
So how did they eventually fade away?
Over time, President Teddy Roosevelt started to have as part of his administration reforming all this.
Mm-hmm.
They started enforcing the laws. They started throwing some of these people in jail. And we talked about it earlier in this school year. They used a merit-based system instead of this spoil system for jobs. So they put laws to the city of New York and said, all right, you want to hire police officers? You can't just hire somebody off the boat because they're giving you money. You have to give them a test. They have to do a physical test. And if they can't pass those tests, they can't have a job. No more do you just say, vote for me and you get a job. Now they have this merit-based system where you actually have to be qualified for the job to get the job. And this is how the government started to fight against political machines. Is it completely fixed today in the year 2020? No. Most of the federal government is based on the merit system, and it's kind of hard to get a federal government job without going through this merit-based system that really is geared toward and tries to hire the best qualified people, all right? But particularly at the higher levels of these organizations, how do you get the job? You're appointed as a political appointee. So, example, the FBI. If you want to be an FBI agent, you get to take tests, you get background screening, you get a security screening, you have a physical screening. But if you want to run the entire FBI, you just got to get picked by the president. Okay? So most of these organizations are merit-based, and the merit-based system and civil service reforms are what killed the political machines. The political machines started dying into the mid to late 1900s. That makes sense?
Yes.
Awesome questions, thank you. All right, so the parties have to select candidates for all these elections, but the big one and the one we'll talk about most is the president. They do it through this system of primaries. A primary is just a vote in a state. Most use a direct primary. What happens is, and we just did this in Florida a few months back, both parties pick a date for a primary election, you go in and you vote. Pretty easy. If I'm a Republican, typically you'll have what's called a closed primary. I can only vote for the Republican candidates. If it's a closed primary and I'm registered Democrat, I can only vote for the Democrats. So I'm a Democrat, I want to vote in the Democratic primary, I go to the voting station, I get a ballot, and I'll see Bernie Sanders, Andrew Yang, Pete Buttigieg, Joe Biden. And I vote for one of those. I'm a Republican, I show up, I see Donald J. Trump, Bill Weld, and I can't remember the other competitor. And I vote the state tallies the votes. Whoever wins is going to win the delegates from that state. So Donald Trump won the primary election in Florida, so he gets those delegates, which make him what? More than likely going to be the Republican candidate for president. Joe Biden basically blew Bernie Sanders out in Florida big time. So he gets Florida's delegates, who in the national convention will support him as the Democratic candidate for president. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So, like, what if a Democrat wants to vote for a Republican candidate?
We'll get to that. What I just discussed is something that's going to call it a closed primary. Some states have open primaries and they become problematic. All right. So the closed primary, you only vote for your candidate. If I'm registered as a Democrat, I can only vote for the Democrats. If I'm registered as a Republican, I only vote for the Republicans. And again, this is still just the primary election, not the general election when I vote for the actual president. I'm just voting for the party's candidates for the presidential election. Closed makes sense. Open is problematic. And I describe it in here, and there's a link which I want you to look at. South Carolina has an open primary. As long as you're a registered voter, you can vote for whoever you want. So what Republicans were doing in South Carolina were voting in the Democratic primary and trying to vote for the weakest candidate they thought they had. So Republicans were voting in the Democratic primary for Bernie Sanders because they think Donald Trump has a better chance of beating Bernie Sanders than Joe Biden. And they even had a plan on it. They called this Operation Chaos. They were going to create chaos and havoc to the Democratic Party by purposely voting for who they thought was the worst Democratic presidential candidate. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but what if it like backfired on them, and then since the lack of votes that they were giving to the Republicans, their Republican candidate was just like,
oh no, that doesn't matter. There would still be Republicans voting for Trump.
yeah.
But other Republicans would vote deliberately for the Democrat to try to give some advantage to the weakest possible Democratic opponent.
Yeah.
Think of it as you're playing sport and you can choose your own schedule. And you're like, gee, I'm going to play all the weak teams. So in an open primary, you're basically choosing your opponent. So most states don't have open primaries. Most states are like Florida, which have closed primaries. Maybe tricky to understand. If you really don't get it, click that link on the slideshow in Files. How do you win? It depends. Each state is different. In most states, all you need is a
Plurality.
Plurality. Thank you, Effie. I couldn't say it. Plurality, which means you get the majority, you get more votes. So this is important because you could have 3, 4, 5 candidates running. Whoever gets the plurality of votes wins. Other states are different and require a majority, which means you have to get more than 50% of the vote. And that can be hard if you're running against 3, 4, 5 people. And in that case, if it requires a majority, they will have a runoff. So Abby and I are running in a primary, and we have 4 other contenders. Abby and I are the 2 top candidates, but neither of us gets over 50% of the vote. So that state will give another vote called a runoff election where only it's the 2 of us against each other. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So now you will actually have a winner in that case, right?
So this is just for primary? Or
This is
all?
still just talking about primaries.
Okay.
Yes. The general election, when we actually elect the president, of course, is going to be different. Because that gets into the electoral college, which people don't like because it's confusing and complicated and does weird things like I could get the most votes and still lose, but we've talked about that a lot. Remember, when we're talking here, we're just talking about primary elections. Getting the candidates who will contend against each other in the real election, the general election. All right, major parties are always what?
Republican, Democrat.
And they are always?
On the ballot.
Yep. Third parties have to do what?
get a petition?
Probably. And it depends. Each state runs its own election, so what happens in Florida isn't the same that happens in Missouri or California. But typically the state requires proving that you could have some sort of support, and the way you prove that is by a petition. What else do parties do? They clearly support candidates with money, with people, with time. If I'm the Republican candidate, the Republican National Committee is going to support me with money, people, phone calls, advertisements, commercials, etc. They communicate with the citizens. The Republican National Committee will talk directly to citizens, telling them to support their candidate, in this case, Donald Trump. Same thing with the Democrats. George Washington warned us against this. They did, he did. We didn't listen. But parties functionally run the government. Why? They're part of a team. They work together. They believe in sort of the same things. So, when you look at the Senate, what's important to look at? The party makeup. Currently, who has the majority in the Senate? Republicans or Democrats?
Republicans.
Republicans, which is important because now it's easier to get Republican bills made into law in the Senate. And the biggest thing we saw in a thing like impeachment, if you have a Republican majority in the Senate, does the impeached president found innocent or guilty?
Innocent.
Which is exactly what we saw. The parties tend to stick together because they believe generally in the same stuff. All right? So, functionally, these parties wind up running the government.
Isn't that kind of corrupt, though? Because if you can get out, like, I mean, if you can, like, build up your Senate of majority of your party, doesn't that kind of skew how big decisions could be made in your favor?
Yes. I wouldn't use the word corrupt, though. What Washington would say is, it isn't in the best interest of the country.
Mm-hmm.
Because if a party is making decisions for a party, does that help the entire country?
No.
Probably not. There's 330 million Americans. Some are Democrat, some are Republican, and some are independent. So if you're making decisions just because it's a party decision, 2/3 of the country doesn't like that.
Do you ever think that there would be like a law made where the Senate has to be like equal in the amount of like parties from both sides?
I can't see that. This is the one thing I don't think I'll see in my lifetime, but you may see in yours. A rise of a third or a fourth party. I think the only way that kind of gets fixed is we have a third or a fourth party.
Mm-hmm.
All right? So let's say one of the parties kind of splits or crumbles after the 2020 election and creates a third party. And not just a third party, but a meaningful third party. All right? Then that may force more working together, broader range of ideas. But right now, the two-party system, I wouldn't say it's corrupt. But what you do get is the Senate is solely focused on Republican issues. Just like the House today has a Democratic majority. So they focus mostly on Democratic issues, Democratic platform priorities. Absolutely. So does that mean they don't work together well? Absolutely. So is that important a lot of the time? A lot of the time we could work our way through it. Does it get tricky in things like wars or like COVID-19, flu pandemics? Yes. That's when party politics, it isn't corrupt, but it does not seem to be something that helps America in general.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Running the government and linking different parts of the government. Government is big and huge, 3 branches, millions of employees. Sometimes it's connected by that party membership. If I'm a Republican and I could work with Republicans, we talk the same language, we agree, we have the same contacts and context, so that make us work together. And then finally, you act as a watchdog on the other side. So if there's a Republican president, who's going to be laser focused on that Republican president, making sure he or she's doing the right thing?
The other parts of the government?
The Democrats and vice versa. All right? So you just don't have citizens watching the government. You don't just have the media watching the government. You don't just have these three branches watching each other. You have a party watching the other party. So when President Obama was president, what party was he?
Democrat.
Democratic. Who was watching him like a hawk?
All the Republicans.
All the Republicans, and vice versa. Who's trying to keep the Trump administration accountable, and they make mistakes, they try to tell everybody? Democrats. Why? Because these parties act as watchdogs. So again, the biggest thing is a party supports a candidate for election. They print signs, they get out for rallies and meetings, they knock on doors, they make television commercials and try to support their candidate. Mitt Romney in 2008, Republicans. Hey, what color are all these signs, Abby?
Red, white, and blue.
Why?
Because, well, those are the colors of the parties and also just America.
We're going to talk about, when we talk about propaganda, symbolism. If you were an American politician running for office, would you pick a green, orange, and purple motif?
No.
Probably not, because Americans identify with red, white, and blue, and just, it hits you as American and patriotic if you use those colors. Here we got some relatively young folks going out to talk to an older voter. Guess what? Older voters are important. Why, Abby?
Because, is it like they make up the majority of the votes?
No. But I don't have to make up the majority if I actually go out and do what?
Vote.
Vote.
So they vote more?
Old people vote. Young people don't. So remember that when you're 18. If you don't like the system the way it is, and you think it's biased towards older people or it's not responsive to young people, it's because young people don't vote. It's that easy. If I'm a politician and I'm trying to get elected, I already know not to spend time on young people because they don't come out to vote. The data, last thing I saw, 18 to 25-year-olds only vote like 25% of the time. 65 and up are voting like 75, 80% of the time. Think about that, young Americans. Register to vote and then actually go and vote. And if you don't sit there and say, oh, this is the boomers are destroying the country. Yeah, and why are the boomers running everything? Because you were sitting on the couch eating Takis and posting to Instagram and you're not out there
voting.
The watchdog role. You're going to see throughout political history investigations. The House or the Senate investigates one part of the government or the other. Here we have the Republican Party doing investigations on Hillary Clinton's emails and Benghazi and all that stuff. All right? Politically motivated? Sure. The parties have a reason to keep an eye on the other party. And it does help keep the system a little more honest. If I'm a Republican president and I know I mess up and the Democrats are going to be watching me and then tell everybody, yeah, should that moderate my behavior? It should. Does it always? I don't know. But the parties act as watchdogs on each other. And that should be thought of as a benefit of the American people. If I'm a Democrat or a Republican citizen, it shouldn't matter to me what party my president is if they're doing the wrong thing. See, does that make sense?
Yeah.
Can that be hard to do, though?
Yeah, especially if you really are political and you might not want to see your party's mistakes or misfires.
You don't want to see your team lose.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's as simple as that. But sometimes you shouldn't support your team if they're really what?
Messing up.
Messing up. Particularly in politics where it's important. You may be a Georgia or Florida fan. It doesn't matter what those teams ever do. You're going to be that fan for the rest of your life. Yeah, we could all get through that. Politics,
yeah.
Now it's a little more important. You'll see on our teams, I posted something about Teddy Roosevelt. Look at what he says about supporting your president. Is it right to support your president no matter what he or she does, even if they're doing the wrong thing? Mm-hmm. It's up to you to decide. Click these links, a lot of good videos. It'll explain this material much better than I can, probably. Here's your questions. I've had some people ask questions about I want you to submit this to me the best way you can. Notebook isn't up and running yet. I need to still work on that. So when you work on these questions, what can you do? Type it in a Word file, attach it to an email, send it to me. Type it straight into an email. Type it straight into chat. Write it, take a picture of it, send me the picture. Does that kind of make sense, folks? And if you still struggle, you have more questions, please don't be afraid to ask. Anything else, Abigail?
No, sir.
Cool.